Playing Nirvana.
The Cobain 50.
Nirvana.
Kurt Cobain's top 50 albums.
Nirvana.
From listener-powered KEXP.
This is the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP. I'm Martin Douglas.
And I'm Dusty Henry. This week, Martin dives into the album Pagan Icons by Saccharine Trust, which dropped in 1981.
Even though this EP rules, I use this episode more as like a reason to get into the history of SST, which is one of the great punk labels in American history.
Yeah, I feel like we've talked about SST. We've referenced it a lot because it's come up in so many episodes, but we haven't really talked about it as an entity. And I feel like this is the perfect band to really get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the SST originals, I would say. Yeah.
And this episode is actually longer than the EP itself, maybe a first on the Cobain 50.
It didn't take very much effort on my end, to be honest. But yeah, it definitely is.
Well, with that, let's get into it. Here's Martin Douglas on Saccharine Trust's Pagan Icons.
SST Records is one of the most storied punk labels in the history of music. You could even argue the Southern California label is at the top of that category. SST put so many bands on the map, including Black Flag, Minutemen, Husker Du, and Meat Puppets. Buried somewhere in that roster is a band with ties to Minutemen, one with a profound influence on the Northwest rock scene, particularly the Melvins, who in turn inspired a very young Kurt Cobain and ushered him into the punk community. That band is called Saccharine Trust, and in terms of SST originals, they might just be the label's most overlooked band.
We don't need freedom. We don't want freedom. We don't need freedom. Freedom is what ruins your brain. Creativity, drugs, and pain. Freedom is what lets you run wild. Explain freedom to your fatherless child.
Along the southern edge of Los Angeles are the neighborhoods of Wilmington and San Pedro, two locales crucial to the story of Saccharine Trust. Both San Pedro and Wilmington sit beside each other on the coast of the South Bay and serve as harbor for the Port of Los Angeles. Just east is the city of Long Beach, to give you a better geographical sense. Saccharine Trust vocalist Jack Brewer was born in Havana, Cuba, but his family moved around a lot, eventually settling in the South Bay. When Jack was a teenager, he played in a new wave band called The Obstacles. As a day job, he worked as the lead for a mailing service company, where a young man by the name of Joe Biza came in looking for a job. As co-workers, it didn't take long before Biza and Brewer became friends. According to Biza, speaking to the underground music website Perfect Sound Forever, he and Brewer talked about music all the time while working together. Biza was interested in LA's blooming punk scene, which eventually led to Brewer inviting him to an Obstacles rehearsal. Brewer didn't like the drumming. He told Perfect Sound Forever that the drummer sounded kind of like a Keith Moon who didn't know where he was. When Brewer asked Biza for feedback the next day, he avoided mentioning his dislike of the drumming and mentioned that the band needed a bassist. According to Biza, Brewer immediately asked him if he wanted to be the bassist for the Obstacles. Before that point, he hadn't seriously considered becoming a musician. He had aspirations of becoming a visual artist, but felt that music could be a conceptual art experiment for him. So he said yes. Biza noticed the other members of the Obstacles expressing their dissatisfaction, fearing that he would steer the band towards punk rock. which is pretty much exactly what happened. Biza told Perfect Sound Forever that he took Brewer to his first punk show at the famous Hong Kong Cafe in Chinatown, arguably the epicenter of the LA punk scene in the late 1970s.
It was just like nothing I had ever seen before.
The scene is starting to come along.
The Hong Kong became really famous really fast.
That night, Brewer sported long hair and a full beard. The next day, Biza says Brewer showed up on his doorstep with a haircut and a fresh shave, and that's how he knew Brewer was interested in pursuing punk in his music. And with this change, other members of the Obstacles started dropping out of the band one by one until only Biza and Brewer remained. That's when Biza switched from bass to guitar, and Brewer became the lead vocalist, and they started to write songs together. When it came time to rename this group with Brewer and Biza at the helm, Brewer, a hardcore David Bowie fan, named the band after a lyric from a track from Hunky Dory called The Bewlay Brothers.
And the good men tomorrow had their feet in the wallow and their heads abroad when ice ashorn, and how they bought their positions with Saccharine and Trust.
Saccharine Trust.
And the world was asleep to our latent fuss.
It took the better part of a year to solidify the Saccharine Trust lineup, but they finally did in 1980. In the decade since, aside from the band's founding members, they've been more or less a revolving door of musicians. Biza and Brewer moved from Wilmington to San Pedro, and Saccharine Trust played their first show at a backyard barbecue in Wilmington. They were alongside another San Pedro band that had formed 6 months earlier, the Minutemen.
Undetermined where to go, no solutions to our problems.
Later in 1980, Saccharine Trust was invited by Black Flag to play a show at the Star Theater in San Pedro. In an interview with Charlie Ambler for Vice, Biza said that after the gig, SST co-owners Greg Ginn and Chuck Dukowski approached the band about putting out a project on the label.
35,000 sits back to my name. Spent the rest on pot and cocaine.
When Ginn was 12 years old, he began Solid State Transmitters, a mail-order business specializing in World War II surplus radio equipment. Galvanized by the punk rock movement years later, he started a band, but couldn't find a label to put out its records, so he decided to do it himself. Initially, SST Records was founded by Ginn in order to release the music by his iconic hardcore band Black Flag. If you haven't already, check our archive to listen to not one, but 2 Black Flag episodes of the Cobain 50, where we cover their debut full-length Damaged, as well as their second album, My War. After capitalizing on the notoriety of Black Flag, the label put out Minutemen's debut release in 1980, a 7-inch EP called Paranoid Time.
Still the QTC, place lives this time.
Since Minutemen and Saccharine Trust were friends based in the same neighborhood, for a few years they almost took on the role of sibling bands. Minutemen founding member Mike Watt started his own label called New Alliance, and before recording their SST debut, Saccharine Trust contributed a song to New Alliance's first release, a compilation titled Cracks in the Sidewalk. The song was called Hearts and Barbarians.
Night fell, as light was no more. He and my love at the foot of hope. Word was out, the suit say it was right. No more laws, a time to do.
In December of 1981, Saccharine Trust released their debut full-length, Pagan Icons. Like Hearts and Barbarians, Pagan Icons was produced by Spot, SST's renowned house producer and engineer. Spot's studio was located in Hermosa Beach, also the hometown of Black Flag, who, along with the Minutemen, recorded most of their best-known work with Spot.
Pages turn my stare, burn the conflict of logic, crowd stands in awe.
Biza told Vice that he felt Pagan Icons sounded like a beginner's effort and expresses disbelief that there are fans to this day discovering the album. In my opinion, it's not that unfathomable. Early SST bands, Saccharine Trust included, sought to be original even when it confused their core audience. Biza said it himself in the Perfect Sound Forever interview about the San Pedro punk scene. He said, "In Pedro, everyone challenged themselves to be different. People gravitate towards bands trying to do something singular, and Pagan Icons doesn't quite sound like any other band lugging gear around South LA at the time."
You were always cunning like the games you play. Your mind is kind, as friends would say. Got what you wanted, but not what you needed. That's how hard you pleaded.
And Biza in particular was coming into Saccharine Trust with no musical influences because, again, he had no intentions on even becoming a musician prior to Brewer's invitation. In turn, many of Biza's scratchy guitar riffs retain a sense of melody, but also occasionally dip their toes into dissonant waters.
It was just the community line. That's why we never felt any guilt. Father Times ridiculed her. Knew she wasn't any worse than the rest of us.
With Brewer's captivating lyrics and sneering vocals, Biza's abrasive guitar had the perfect bedfellow. And although the Minutemen were putting Biza onto bands like The Fall and Gang of Four, Saccharine Trust always encouraged themselves to do their own thing. There was also a healthy sibling competition between the two bands because they both wanted to play the set everyone goes home talking about.
I saw a young lamb playing with its executor.
Although Biza described Saccharine Trust to Perfect Sound Forever as the black sheep of the family, the band was one of the pillars of SST's early days, and they stayed close to their friends in Minutemen. Biza even contributed guitar to their debut album, What Makes a Man Start Fires. And Brewer helped write the song God Bows to Math from Minutemen's essential double LP, Double Nickels on the Dime.
In the tomb of Enoch, in the Queen's chamber, she lay.
Saccharine Trust continued to put out music on SST until their initial breakup in 1986. SST was nearing its peak this year with two monumental releases, Bad Brains' Eye Against Eye, and Sonic Youth's third full-length, Evol. Saccharine Trust reunited 10 years later in 1996. Their lineup, which included Chris Stein on bass and Brian Christopherson playing drums, remained intact for over 2 decades. In 2001, they put out a third full-length, The Great One Is Dead.
The pathetic sun crawls out from its eastern shift, leaving Magellan to die, and Dardanel at last.
Even though they weren't the most famous of bands that were on SST, Saccharine Trust were well regarded by those deeply entrenched in the punk scene. For example, Sonic Youth covered Pagan Icons' standout track, I Am Right, for the 1988 SST mini compilation, The Mini Plot. For being the so-called black sheep of one of the top independent labels of its generation, Saccharine Trust did pretty well for themselves. Sure, they were overlooked, but they not only came up in one of the most fertile punk scenes in the history of the genre, they stood out. They took a desire to be original, a benchmark of punk that dwindles with each passing decade, and plowed through a period that spawned a worldwide explosion in punk music and culture. And they came out of the other side maybe a little less famous than many of their peers, but well respected all the same.
What is it really taking? Is it the taker? What is it really taking? Is it the taker?
That was our very own Martin Douglas digging into Saccharine Trust's 1981 EP, Pagan Icons.
The cool thing about this album, this EP, is that it's so good because the band tries a variety of styles. And as I mentioned in the episode, that all was kind of inspired by the Minutemen, who shockingly don't have an album on Kurt's list.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the SST discography, like, I feel like you could just copy and paste that to be Kurt's list.
Yeah. Oh my God. I feel like there were little inklings of things in various Kurt biographies that, you know, where Kurt mentioned wanting to be on SST. But I think that by the time, you know, they recorded Bleach, SST wasn't really as valuable in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's fun like looking through this stuff because I was flipping through the journals the other day trying to find something, and there's like a letter he wrote about like trying to get on Touch and Go.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like so much, like, it can't be understated like how important these small punk labels really were, like Sub Pop, of course, like when they were smaller too, K Records,
yeah,
and Kill Rockstars, where like it's so easy to get music now. We talk about this all the time. We probably sound like cranky old podcasters, but that was really the way you could find out music. You find a label that spoke to you and had the bands you liked, and you just devoured it. And like, that's how you got fed new music, was getting into this like machine of indie labels.
Exactly. I feel like labels back then and even today, but I think the thing about labels back then is that they did have a defining ethos or a sound that you could gravitate towards, and it became, oh, you like this band. Oh, you like Nirvana. Oh, Bleach. Yeah, Bleach is a great album. Have you heard this band Soundgarden? They're on Sub Pop too. Like, that was kind of the language of getting into bands, you know, back in our day.
Yeah, back in our day.
Okay, millennial.
Yeah. I love whenever I like pick up an older record and it has like those like catalogs, like check, they can send in, like, get the new Black Flag for $5, like mail this back to us. Like, that's so much a way you don't even know. Like, you got to rely on like Maximum Rock and Roll or whatever to like know what you might be getting.
Right.
But you kind of put some trust in the label.
And it's one of those things, it's the thrill of discovery that we've talked about quite a few times on the series. And yeah, I feel as though we can't talk about Saccharine Trust without mentioning that they were kind of the black sheep of the SST roster. Like, they don't really get the shine that bands like Black Flag or the Minutemen, or even later, like bands like Husker Du and Sonic Youth did.
I love that they kind of self-identified in that way too. Like, if you read their bios online, they're like, we were like the not as good band on SST, which is like selling themselves short, of course. You know, it'd be like being on the all-star team and it's just like me, you know, like at the Olympics, I'd be like, maybe put LeBron in. I don't know.
Or like, it's funny that you mentioned that, because when you said that, I was thinking of like the 1992 Dream Team.
Right.
And, you know, you've got Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, and then way on the end of the bench, you've got the most hated dude in the history of college basketball, Christian Laettner. It's kind of like, yeah, let's just say Saccharine Trust are the Christian Leitner of the SST Olympic team.
Yeah, they're like, between us, Black Flag, Sonic Youth, Husker Du, we really made that label.
But what I will say is that they actually are a really good band. And for my money, one of the SST originals that didn't get that success because they were kind of winding down and their initial breakup came as SST was just starting to break through in the marketplace beyond punk music and into not necessarily the mainstream, but like definitely people outside of the insular network of punk music in the 80s were starting to notice SST.
Oh, for sure. Even just like thinking of some of the names like Sonic Youth and, Husker Du, like Soundgarden.
Yeah.
Like these bands, like it's almost like in the major labels were looking at labels like SST for like, what's the next big thing? Like what is happening in the underground that, yeah, this is where you kind of like, it's like more sports references, like you're playing in the minor leagues and get pulled up into literally the majors.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because the principal members of Saccharine Trust, Joe Baiza and Jack Brewer, actually have very deep ties to one of the tentpole bands of SST, the Minutemen. I mean, both of them contributed to Minutemen Records. Baiza played guitar on 1983's What Makes a Man Start Fires, and Brewer helped write 2 songs on what I deem as an all-time classic, Double Nickels on the Dime.
One of the best SST records. One of the best records of that era.
I mean, yeah, just one of the great double albums of the past 40 years.
I wish it made the list. Kurt's list, so we could do a whole episode on that.
Yeah. I even think of things like in A Wailing of a Town, an oral history of early San Pedro punk and more, there was an anecdote where Mike Watt auditioned for Saccharine Trust and didn't make the cut, which is so weird to me, but also it ultimately ended up working out for him.
It's always some funny stories like that you hear, like, I don't know, like Kurt trying to pull in Mudhoney guitarists in for Nirvana and things, but
Dan Peters auditioning on drums for Nirvana. Yeah, imagine if that were to happen and Dave did not end up trying out for the band, even, having anything to do with the band. Like, it's so nuts to think of the tiny degrees in which music history could have been altered exponentially.
Yeah. Just one lineup changes everything. And, it's like funny too that like, how Saccharine Trust kind of plays up this like self-deprecation of we weren't the best SST band. When again, this is a really great record.
Yeah.
And for 16 minutes, you get a lot of bang for your buck. Really easy to replay. But it's kind of like what we were talking about in the Tales of Terror episode about like these bands are the lifeblood, like, the smaller bands being the lifeblood of a scene. Bands like Saccharine Trust are the lifeblood of an SST.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you go through like, you think about Sub Pop, sure, you think about Nirvana or the Shins or Postal Service, whatever you want to pick. Big albums.
Yeah.
But there's hundreds of albums between those.
Absolutely.
And yeah, maybe they don't all take off in that way that, maybe the label hopes. So I'm sure they hope everything takes off. But that's what makes it special. That's what keeps it going. It's to celebrate the music and to have someone get behind a band like Saccharine Trust is really cool and really important. And
right.
You never know where that's going to go.
In the later years of SST, especially with a band like Sonic Youth, which I documented in the Sonic Youth episode, where they were saying we were distancing ourselves from SST because the quality control was less than the early years, the tentpole years. So it's crazy to think about a great band like Saccharine Trust being considered like a mid-tier SST band when the mid-tier SST bands of later in the era were not nearly as good.
Yeah. And wasn't it in that episode, it was like, was SST where you had to have unanimous buy-in from everyone in the label and Sonic Youth kept getting denied?
Yes. And then Joe Carducci left and Greg Ginn reportedly contacted Kim and Thurston minutes after he left and signed Sonic Youth.
The real Minuteman. This piece was produced by Martin Douglas. Audio is mixed by Roddy Nikpour. Our podcast manager is Isabel Khalili, and Larry Mizell Jr. is our director of editorial.
And as always, if you like what you're hearing on the Cobain 50 or any of our podcasts, please consider donating to KEXP, listener-powered radio, as we like to say here at KEXP. You could give a one-time donation. You could become an amplifier for around $6 a month. And thanks to everyone who has donated or is considering donating to KEXP. I'm Martin Douglas.
And I'm Dusty Henry. We'll see you next week on the Cobain 50 from listener-powered KEXP, where the music matters. It's one of those names that I've never said out loud. I also read that in my head initially as Paganicons. And I was like, what's a Paganicon? Do, 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 do.